Remember, students, that it is most of the times, it is wrongly written the wasteland as two words. So I told you that the wasteland is not two words, this is the three words. ये जिसे कहते हैं वो T.S. Eliot ने खुद भी अब देखें the wasteland, there are three words. T.S. Eliot himself said this thing, that my poem is, the title of my poem is three words starting with the, means starting with definite article. तो the wasteland जो है वो the wasteland एक word में भी अमूमन लिखा जाता है, तो that is the novel or something like that, वो कोई novel वगैरह है, the wasteland, ठीक. So today we are going to start that, the wasteland. Students, I tell you few things about modern poetry. First of all, since this will be a very different experience of yours to read a modern poetry. Modern poetry is usually not like a poetry as you have read previously, as for example, you read your romantics, as you read your Victorian age writers. So it is not like that. There are many variations that you see, not even in the modern poetry, but in the rest of the genres that had been written in the modern time. Modern time is usually considered here 20th century. 20th century के एतबार से हम बात करते हैं. 20th century is to be called as the modern time, right? So since that the wasteland was written in the early half of the 20th century, so it is the modern work. उसके बाद भी शाहकार ऐसे वर्क्स हैं कि जो कि हमारे कोर्स में फिलहाल नहीं है, लेकिन आपको जिसे कहते हैं वो दिए गए, एज फॉर एग्जांपल द सिल्विया प्लाथ एंड टेड ह्यूज, तो दे आर इन योर कोर्स, दे आर वेरी वंडरफुल राइटर्स, तो बहरहाल वी शैल रीड देम. तो फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल स्टूडेंट्स, आई टेल यू दैट मॉडर्न entire genres of literature had undergone a drastic change. Those literary conventions have to the maximum been challenged in the modern times. For example, if you read novels, and you would see that one thing that was very important, and that was the plot of the novel. Since that Aristotle once had said that it is possible to create a tragedy without a character, but it is not possible to create it without plot. So that means that he understands this plot is very much important. Plot की example थोड़ी सी मैं आपको दूं तो it is like that कि as E.M. Forster in his book Aspects of the Novel gave us an example, and he said that whenever you say this thing, that a king dies and then the queen dies. For example, there are two examples before you. One is that king dies and then the queen dies. तो वो कहता है कि this is not a plot, this is the story. Story is just only events in the chronological order. जब आप ये बात कहते हैं कि king dies and then the queen dies because of grief, so this is the plot, because plot gives you reason as well at the same time. It connects all events of certain fiction logically, उसको logically connect करता है. There was a logic why queen dies. Queen dies because of the grief. So this is plot. Whenever we just say that the king dies and then the queen dies, so that is the story. This is not a plot. It's a story. When we say the king dies and the queen dies because of grief, so it is logically connected with the previous event, why the queen dies. So this is actually a plot. The one thing is that. Another thing is that you have to give suspense in the plot. आप plot में suspense create करते हैं ना, तो by withholding certain information. So when you withhold certain information and you reveal that information later in time, so it means that you are not going to present entire of those events chronologically. तो आप chronologically बयान नहीं कर रहे थे. So this is another definition of the plot. Whatever that was, plot was considered as the most important thing in any narration. Now let's see that there are, in the modern times, there are the novels that had been written in which there is no plot, or you see that there is entirely a loose plot. वहां पे कोई plot नहीं है, वहां पे कोई कहानी नहीं है, वहां पे बात ही कुछ और हो रही है. The great example of this specimen of the modern narration, that is actually To the Lighthouse. आप To the Lighthouse की example दे सकते हैं, Ulysses की example दे सकते हैं, जो कि जेम्स जॉयस ने लिखा है. So there is actually no any plot. The writer had not concentrated on the events, rather he had concentrated on some psychological matters. There had been distortions. There have been distortions of the long-standing conventions prior in the time, right from the time of the Aristotle down to the time of this Victorian age. So you see that the people actually follow those long-standing literary conventions. So you see in the 20th century there is a hallmark of the great change, and you see that in the modern times there is a modern time was the time of the distortion. They have distorted many things. आप to the lighthouse पढ़ें तो आपको अंदाजा होगा आप तो कोई कहानी पढ़ ही नहीं रहे. It is not a story basically. वो कोई story नहीं है. There is no narration ही नहीं है. There is no conflict ही नहीं है. So this is what I mean to say, that whenever there are the two people and you narrate story between them, the events between them, तो that is actually a conflict. उसको आप conflict कहेंगे ना. तो जब वो character ही दो उस तरह से नहीं है, and the writer has most of the times peeped into the mind of the characters and he gives his mental landscape in that sense of the word. So it means that there is no plot at all. वो तो कुछ plot है ही नहीं है. भाई दो आदमियों के दरमियान दो आदमियों के माबैन कोई बात ही नहीं, कोई इवेंट्स ही नहीं है, तो फिर कौन से इवेंट्स वो आएंगे, किस तरह का प्लॉट जनरेट होगा. So that is what I told you, that in modern time was a time of great dramatic distortions with respect to the conventions, the long-standing conventions. So now come to poetry. So I am basically telling you the distortions. So poetry mein, you see that there is iambic pentameter most of times. Most of times you see there are meters. Meters इस्तेमाल होते हैं. Very few poems are there, जिस तरह कि हमने कुछ टेनिसन की इस तरह से पढ़ी हैं, which are in the blank verse. So blank verse is a poem which does not have rhyme, but still it has meter. मीटर तो फिर भी होता है ना, राइम नहीं होती ना. जैसे उर्दू में आप कहें बैर जैसे कहते हैं मौजूद है अपनी जगह पे, लेकिन ये जरूर है कि आगे काफिया नहीं है. So that is what we call a blank verse. So blank verse had been used. But in the modern time, you see there is a free verse. So free verse means there is no regular meter. Meters are employed there, no doubt, but there is no regular meter. It does not look like a poetry itself. For example, I give you here examples. यहाँ पे आप देखें. And he said, Mary, Mary, hold on tight, and down we went in the mountains, and where we feel free. I read much of the night and go south in the winter. Does it look like a poetry? Does it give an effect of the rhythm? No, it does not. It is like a common speech. A common speech है. अब यहाँ पे आप देखें ना. And when we were children staying at the Archduke's, my cousins, he took me out on a sled, and I was frightened. He said, Mary, Mary, hold on tight, and down we went in the mountains. There we feel free. I read that much of the night and go south in the winter. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of the stony rubbish, son of man? You cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images where the sun beats. Okay. So this looks like, if you compare this line, Mary, he said, Mary, Mary, hold on tight, and down we went in the mountains where we feel free. If you compare this with say, for example, the poetry of William Wordsworth, that he said, world has not anything to show more fair, dull would he be of soul who could pass by. Don't you see that the later example of William Wordsworth is quite musical with respect to the regular meter that has been employed there, whereas this example is very close to the conversation. This does not look as an example of the poetry to be sung. Poetry की तो एक सबसे बुनियादी बात ये होती है कि musical होती है, that stands to be sung. You can sing it. आप उसको गाते हैं, शायरी गाई जाती है, because there is music in it. उसमें music है, उसमें rhythm है. So you don't see that there are many free verse passages that the T.S. Eliot has introduced in this poem. And not only the T.S. Eliot, but this is what you will see in the modern poetry. So these are certain examples of distortion. That is what I told you. One more thing, students, if you are in a habit of reading, so I had suggested you to read case book series right in my first class. Aapko yaad hoga. I told you that you must be reading 20th century interpretation series, 20th century views, case book series, and whenever you are going to the text, and I will suggest that if you have this penguin text, that would be the best. So this is what I've been telling you. आपको ये बातें मैं बताता रहा हूँ. Case book series के एक बहुत बड़ा advantage होता है. So advantage is this, that most of times in the books of the case book, you see that there is a sequence of the criticism. Critics that had taken up the work quite in early time and the modern critics. And how would you compare them? So I mean to say that the 20th century is the century of digging more into the poems, discovering much about them. The poems actually stand more and they stand taller than they had been considered once in a time. So students, I tell you that this poem basically talks of the barrenness of the modern civilization. As the very title suggests, the wasteland. The wasteland is the modern time in which you and I live. The wasteland. People, हमें इस तरह की समझ आती है ना, people without aims, people with no standings, with no humanity. इस तरह की बातें हमें समझ आती हैं. The wasteland. So intellectual and as well as spiritual barrenness, this very title actually suggests. ये suggest करता है, right? So one another thing, you see many biblical references and biblical allusions. जिस तरह से, for example, यहाँ पे जो है वो the Son of Man. Where is that? The Son of Man. That is from Ezekiel. Ezekiel is from the Bible. The very title, the burial of the dead, is actually taken from Bible once again, the book of prayers. The book of prayers, and in this book of prayers, that is from 1789 Anglican Book of the Common Prayers, that refers to the funeral services of the high Anglican parishioners. High Anglican parishioners, उनकी जो असल में वो funeral services जो होती हैं, it stands for them. So you see that most of times and all through that very poem, as I will gradually teach you, जिस तरह से आप देखेंगे, many ecclesiastical images pop in. वो pop in करते रहेंगे. For example, hooded figure stands for the Christ. Hooded figure stands for the person with no identity as well. That is equally true at the same time. Okay. One another thing, red rock, once again biblical. I will give you entire reference. जिस तरह से मैं हम पढ़ते जाएंगे तो entire references that I will be telling you. Now the question stands, okay, can we after all confine this poem to be defined only with respect to the images that they are biblical, the images that they are of the modern London or as well as German? क्या वो images के ही एतबार से हम उसे define करेंगे? For example, यहाँ पे Starnberger Sea, this is actually a lake in near Munich in Germany, and as well as Hofgarten. So there are modern references and at the same time old references. So there is an image of dryness, as for example dry tubers. This is जो यहाँ पे मुझे नजर आ रहा है, मैं उसमें से ज्यादा एग्जांपल आपको दे रहा हूँ क्योंकि साथ साथ देखता जा रहा हूँ तो उस एतबार से बात करता जा रहा हूँ ना. तो there are two worlds that are actually juxtaposed. Out of this thing I am going to sum up कि क्या हम इस modern poetry को उसी images के अंदर confine करेंगे, okay, out of which the very clear images that this poem actually gives, they are biblical images, they are the images of the modern civilization. Yes, तो क्या उसी images के अंदर ही रह के, उसकी कैद में रह के क्या हम इसे define करेंगे? I don't consider it like that. Nor even this was considered in the modern critic. Whenever anything is written, it is not writers anymore. No matter that the writer still has copyrights. Copyrights तो writer के ही होते हैं ना. लेकिन वो poem जो है वो फिर writer की नहीं रहती. It is not writers. That is to be taken up by critics, and critics will have their independent arguments, their independent opinions. So at the same time, I will never like to toe the line while explaining this very poem. मैं यही बात यहीं पे इत्तेफाक नहीं करूंगा. If I do that, so that will mar the beauty of that poem. For example, मैं आपको एक example देता हूँ. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire. When T.S. Eliot himself read it, he read this word as not desire, he read it as desire. Stirring dull roots with spring rain, winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dry tears. फिर में पढ़ते हैं. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire. Since the modern poetry is very complex, or if it is not, the modern reader and a modern critic and modern ways of understanding poetry are very complex. So this yardstick we had been applying in previous poems, starting from the Romantics. There are always multiplication of meanings. जैसे हम कहते हैं ना, layers of meanings, different strata of meanings that actually lie in a poem, and yours job is to gradually dissect into it and unravel the beauty by that. So students, this poem, The Wasteland, had actually undergone many revisions done by Ezra Pound. Most of time this poem had been posted to Ezra Pound, and he would suggest many additions and few omissions as well. That is why T.S. Eliot was probably asked that whether this poem was written by T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound, as it implies. So the T.S. Eliot answers to this question saying that no, it was written by T.S. Eliot, not Ezra Pound, on account of the fact that the thought that prevailed through the poem is T.S. Eliot's thought, and in this connection, Ezra Pound has done nothing. आप एक पोएम लिखते हैं और किसी को देते हैं उसकी तस्रीह करने के लिए, तो वो अगर अपनी थॉट उसमें इनकलकेट कर दे, तो इज इट अ राइट थिंग? क्या ये ठीक बात होगी? तो ऐसा तो नहीं कर सकता ना. तो वो उसमें एडिटिंग वर्ड्स के एतबार से करेगा, थॉट को तो नहीं छेड़ेगा ना. और इफ ही डज दैट, अगर वो ऐसा करता भी है, तो स्टिल दैट ही विल डू इट अंडर योर कंसेंट. उसके लिए एक कंसेंट होगी, उस बिना पे वो करेगा ना. So still that it can never be said that the writer's poem is actually to be written by anyone else. ऐसा नहीं हो सकता. So that is why the T.S. Eliot himself says that it was actually the thought of poem that remains intact and that has not been disturbed by the Ezra Pound. And in this very connection, it should be said that it is written by the T.S. Eliot himself and not the Ezra Pound. So ये बात करने का आखिर पे मकसद क्या था? मकसद ये था कि many of the additions and omissions are done by Ezra Pound. So that is why इसने शुरू में लिखा ना, for Ezra Pound. This poem was dedicated to Ezra Pound because of this. इस वजह से dedicate की. So students, now you have seen that modern poetry is not the poetry like you have read previously. ठीक, इससे आप इसे क्या अंडरस्टैंड करेंगे जब यहाँ पे ये कहता है बिंग काइने रूसन स्टेम एख लिथियन एख डॉइच. दैट इज एक्चुअली जर्मन. ये जर्मन लैंग्वेज है. इट मीन्स दैट आई एम नॉट रशियन एंड आई एम लिथुनियन. दैट इज ट्रू जर्मन. दैट इज व्हाट इट मीन्स. तो आप नहीं अंडरस्टैंड करते कि दिस इज वेरी eclectic sort of expression. Since T.S. Eliot himself is considered as eclectic writer. What does that mean, eclectic? eclectic का मतलब ये है कि where you introduce many things from various sources. जब आप various sources को जैसे आप चीजें इंट्रोड्यूस करके जब you bring them into your composition, so that looks like eclectic. So that is why the one phrase can be used कि जिसको T.S. Eliot के एतबार से कहना चाहिए literary erudition. Erudition का तो मतलब ही यही होता है ना, scholarly approach. तो T.S. Eliot looks more a scholar than a poet because he was too eclectic in his poetry. वो अपनी पोइट्री में बहुत eclectic है. From various different sources, he brings about many references in his poems. Thus, this thing makes his poem complex. It looks as if that he is teaching you history, he is teaching you Greek mythology, he is teaching you Hindu mythology. Since many of the words from the Hindu Upanishads have been introduced, उसमें आपने पढ़ा ना कि da dayadvam damyata shanti shanti shanti. So there are Hindu Upanishads. ये तो Upanishads के words हैं. So it looks like that T.S. Eliot is more concerned about these things than a poet. He does not look like a poet. Literary erudition तो इस बात को कहेंगे ना. He is too erudite in his poetry that it does not give him an effect of the poetry. वो poetry नजर ही नहीं आती. वो हमें scholarly approach नजर आती है. Don't you see that this is the German expression that is very scholarly. और फिर आप ये देखें ना, frisch wieder wind heimat zu, mein English king du willest du, Udi an leer dismeer. So, and as well as Madame Sosostris, from where that he had taken that reference, from where he had taken the reference of the belladonna. What is the lady of the belladonna? What is the lady of the rocks? ये कौन सी बात है? ये क्या बात है? जी? So this is from the paintings of the Leonardo da Vinci. Madame Sosostris is the mark word. That is the Egyptian mark word. कहीं इजिप्शियन रेफरेंसेस हैं, कहीं जर्मन रेफरेंसेस हैं, कहीं बिब्लिकल रेफरेंसेस हैं, कहीं मॉडर्न लंदन के रेफरेंसेस हैं, कहीं मॉडर्न सिविलाइजेशन के रेफरेंसेस हैं, कहीं जिसे कहते हैं वो फिशर किंग के रेफरेंसेस हैं. सो मेनी रेफरेंसेस. देयर इज अ hodgepodge of the references. You must be a great scholar to have read all those things before you read this poem and understand that. अब यहाँ पे टेरिट पैक ऑफ कार्ड्स का यहाँ पे रेफरेंस है. ये कंप्लीट रेफरेंस है. आपको पता चलना चाहिए कि टेरिट पैक ऑफ कार्ड्स क्या चीज होती है, वो किस चीज को कहते हैं. लेडी ऑफ सिचुएशन इसको क्यों कहा गया है? Why it is like that? The man with 3 staves. What is this? Hanged man is a reference of the टेरिट पैक ऑफ कार्ड for what? So there is वो जिसे कहते हैं ना कि every line is full of references. So this is one thing that is very much complex, that makes him complex rather to read and to understand. So that is why this is called literary erudition. He has introduced his erudition in poetry. Poetry is the work of imagination. हिंदू मैथोलॉजी भी पढ़ी हुई है, बहुत सी लैंग्वेजेस जानता था, बहुत बड़ा स्कॉलर था T.S. Eliot. So students, that was rather an introduction of this poem. तो मैंने आपको बताया कि that is why I told you previously that what we are going to read is not very easy poem to understand. It is very hard poem. So you will have certain backgrounds of many things. तो तभी आप understand करेंगे. मैंने आपको बताया कि in the first 4-5 lines we cannot actually confine them into our very common understanding, that is a surface understanding of the poem. ये surface understanding हमें जैसे देती है. ठीक है, this is one way of explaining and one way of understanding a poem, but this is not altogether a way to understand a poem. There are yet many questions, there are yet many ideas to be explained. तो बहुत बात करने की एक चीज में गुंजाइश होती है. So इसीलिए I thought that this is very much necessary before starting this poem, after all, to give you certain image of the poem that what you are going to read. तो ये एक इम्पॉर्टेंट चीज थी, तो इस वजह से मैंने ये बातें आपके सामने की। अब ये देखिए, full of references, an unreal city. What is the unreal city? Whether he is talking about the Jerusalem, whether he is talking about London. यहाँ पे आगे कहता है ना, यहाँ पे उसने लंदन ब्रिज की आपने बात की है, लंदन की भी बात की है। Who was Stetson? Stetson was one of the soldiers that who was in the ship of the Miley, और Tiresias was actually his spokesman. तो यहाँ पे ये देखे, you hypocrite lector, mon semblable mon frère. देखिए, don't you see that different languages at the same time, different references at the same time, they're all illusions. You will have to dig them out. अब यहाँ पे the chair that she sat in, अब ये she किसके लिए stand करता है? Whether that is about the Cleopatra, view of the critics are of the view that this is Shakespeare's Cleopatra from Antony of Cleopatra. So this is at the same time other princes as well. आपको यहाँ पे सोचना पड़ेगा, बहुत कुछ देखना पड़ेगा कि आपके लिए यहाँ पे बहुत सारे रेफरेंसेस हैं, और he puts his readers in a hot water to understand his poems. तो ज्यादा रीडर एक मुश्किल में पड़ जाता है, तो रीडर को तमाम रेफरेंसेस का नहीं पता होता। तो जब तक आपको नहीं पता चलेगा ओ शेक्सपियरियन रैग, अब ये कौन सा, ये कौन सी, ये क्या है, शेक्सपियरियन क्यों नहीं कहा, शेक्सपियरियन रैग, व्हाट इज दैट एक्चुअली, व्हाट इज द रेफरेंस ऑफ व्हाट। तो इस तरह से ये चीजें आपके लिए थोड़ी सी मुश्किल होंगी। तो अब इसी तरीके से आप बहुत सी हैं, इट इज फुल ऑफ देम। अब जाहिर है कि मेरी नजर जिन जिन पे पड़ रही है तो मैं आपके साथ वो बात कर रहा हूं ना। दिस इज दत्त दयाद्वम दम्यतर, शांति शांति शांति। तो ये क्योंकि हमारा अपना एक कल्चर है, हमारे कल्चर से ये बात है, ये इंडियन कल्चर है। इट इज नॉट वेरी कॉम्प्लेक्स फॉर अस टू अंडरस्टैंड कि शांति का क्या मतलब होता है। So you see that such a writer, very strange,